Conversations with Phil. Business advice without the BS. Just straight talk and frank conversations to help you grow your business by teaching you to get more leads, earn more referrals, and close more business.
All right, so I get to talk to my pal Dan Griffin. Dan is this amazing dude that just helps guys get their stuff together. It's really inspiring. I've been fortunate to do some work with Dan, and he is amazing. He teaches me a lot. Even though he's hired me, I learn as much from him as he does from me, and I'm really honored by that. And this past week or so, he shared this quote from Doug Larson that I'd like to use kind of as the framework here that we talk about. And it says, "The world is full of people looking for spectacular happiness while they snub contentment." And with that, Dan Griffin, how are you, buddy? Are you happy or content today, or what's going on?
Yeah, well, I would say I'm content. Happy is a moving line, and in my life right now, getting ready to move from Minneapolis to Los Angeles, being a single father while my wife is building a home for us already in Los Angeles for the last month. What's interesting is I think some people would say, well, my previous definition of happiness would say, well, no, that's not happy because I have some stress and because there's all these different emotions. But the truth is I'm privileged to have this stress, and the emotions come as a result of this opportunity that we have. So unfortunately, I have a hard time just answering any question, yes or no.
No, that's okay, man. And I think that's good, right? It's meant to be dialogue. So that's really cool. So tell us, as you know, knowing that you don't answer yes or no, and knowing that happiness is a flow, tell us a little bit about your background, Dan, and what you do.
Sure. So I appreciate you having me on. And, I'm very interested in this unfolding, almost recreation of men in the 21st century. And it's clearly happening. It's happening everywhere. I don't know how intentional we're being about it. I don't know how consciously we're doing it. And it seems a bit reactive, but it's happening. And I guess, from my perspective, this is such a seismic shift in our culture that it's important to be on top of it. And I've been fortunate to have this in my consciousness and something that I've been passionate about for a very long time. I did my master's research on it I completed my master's in 1998, so almost 20 years ago, looking at the social construction of masculinity in the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I've spent a lot of my time in the addiction mental health field, where I just really looked at the dichotomy that is much bigger than the process of recovery. But in the process of recovery or therapeutic change, there's this whole process of, you have these ideas of being a man that we get inculcated so young that we don't often very aware of, and they just get ground into us day after day from different sources. And then we tell men, well, if you want to live a sober life, if you want to be in recovery, or if you want to engage in therapy, we tell men, don't be vulnerable, don't ask for help, don't share your feelings. Anger is the only acceptable emotion. Relationships are a sign of weakness. Love is for losers. Sex is the only way to connect. And then we put them in this environment, this culture that says, be vulnerable, share your feelings, ask for help, basically all the opposite. And we don't help men navigate that. We just expect them to do it. And so I just was very fortunate to see that. And I just figured everybody else saw it. And for the longest time, for a fair amount of time, I just thought, this isn't that profound, until I really started digging into it. And I realized that there's something there that is not obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. I would say that's, that was my perception as well, that, that it seemed obvious that there is a disconnect there. But the more I read what you've written, the more I watch your videos and stuff, the more I'm like, wow, and the feedback, obviously not just what you say, but the feedback it's amazing how many people crave that navigational assistance and how many people need that, that coaching and such.
Yeah. Well, what was most profound for me, Phil, was I was in a training one day and I was doing this exercise that I do where I show the characteristics, the man rules, right? These whole ideas of being a man. And then I show the principles of recovery, and I put them visually as a dichotomy, and I always have the audience come up with them. Even though I know what they're going to come up with, I always have the audience name it, because that's part of the consciousness, right? If I just wrote it down, they wouldn't be as engaged as if they're the ones giving me the answers. So I was doing that, and then I was talking about relationships, and it just hit me. Holy shit. This list of things that we're asking men to do in recovery, we also expect men to do in relationships, period. And then it was like all of a sudden this work that I was doing that I felt was primarily relegated to the addiction and mental health world suddenly just blew wide open. And I thought, there seems to be something applicable to all men to help men navigate relationships effectively when we've basically been trained not to do that. And even if we've had access at a certain layer, a certain level, then there's that deeper level where we may not even have awareness, let alone access.
Wow. So how do we get awareness? How do we get this access, Dan? I mean, other than obviously reading your books and your blogs and your videos, I mean, can you give us some practical stuff that we can do to get started on that journey?
That's an interesting question. I mean, how do you cultivate awareness? I mean, I come from a fairly spiritual perspective on all this. And there is that classic line of when the student is ready, the master will appear, right? And it's always interesting to try to figure out which one's the student and which one's the master. But I think our society is craving this consciousness and this awareness. And so I'm far from the only person out there, because that's why it's a seismic shift. I mean, it's happening everywhere. It's like Thomas Kuhn was a guy who wrote about scientific revolutions. And what he said is that when the world is ready for a true paradigm shift, you see it popping up all over the place. And that's what we see happening, is this massive awareness around men. So, how do you build awareness? Well, I think one is that we make sure that people know that this is a conversation worth having. We give opportunity for people to know where the conversation is happening. And then I think there has to be a degree of provoking. Because this is not what people are actively looking for. But if I can connect with a woman who's contacting me and she's saying, my brother is struggling with this, or, because that's what I get individual emails, or I get somebody who's saying like, I really need this for my husband. And then I'll say, well, why do you need it for your husband? What's going on? And then suddenly the spouse can see how they've never really seen their husband. And maybe this isn't about their husband having to change. Maybe this is partially about they have to change how they've seen their husband this whole time. And then, and that's a shift too. I wish there was an easy answer to how do you create awareness, but I think individual awareness has its own organic process. It's about exposure. But the more exposure you get, the better. Are you familiar with Brene Brown?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, so let's look at it that way. Before Brene Brown was really carrying the mantle for vulnerability, how much was it on people's minds?
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. I'd never seen a TED Talk, never seen any articles. Yep.
No. In the field, she came out of the addictions and mental health field, by the way. Her first stuff was with Hazelden. So that it was somewhat common in that area. But now you talk to people, who's Brene Brown, you talk about vulnerability, there's a consciousness that's been raised, right? So I think part of it is that as people gravitate more toward a message, they begin to help move it forward. And then there's this process that happens. It's a little bit like Malcolm Gladwell talked about with the tipping point, that there's this time where the the issue's time has come, so to speak.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. So let's get back to that quote a little bit, Dan. Let's talk about that, because I think that's powerful stuff. And you say how that relates to the water. So first, let's dissect that quote, and then let's talk about, what is this water? What the heck does that mean?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, I'm very focused on men. This quote applies to people, and it certainly applies to our society. Our society continues to, I'm a trained sociologist, and part of my thinking was looking at political structures and social structures, economic structures, and we know that our form of capitalism is built on this insatiable appetite, and it's built on never having enough and never being enough. And that's kind of what that spectacular happiness is, this idea of like, one more drink, one more drug, one more car, a bigger house. It's got to be spectacular. It can't be a 40-inch TV. Now it's got to be a 70-inch TV, right? It can't be a suit from Banana Republic. It has to be a Prada suit. And if you don't have the Prada suit, it's not as spectacular. So we assign this external judgment and value to something that has no real inherent value. I mean, the funniest thing is, and Macklemore actually talked about it in his Thrift Shop song, most of these clothes are made in the same freaking warehouse in the same district in China or Taiwan, and then they put the label on, and they have a slightly different thread count. So there's an absurdity to that. But I think it's also that because we're so driven by instant gratification, that we think happiness is a feeling. We think happiness is, if I'm up, I'm happy. So if I'm down, I'm not happy. And so what really kind of stands out to me about this quote is the idea of, we have to shift our idea of what we think happiness even is. Happiness is it's not really a feeling. Another book that I've read for years says happiness is the byproduct of right living. It's not an end in itself. You can't say, I'm going to choose happiness today, and then go around acting like a complete idiot. Unless you're completely disconnected and shameless. I mean, you could question whether that person's happy or just, aloof. But it's a dichotomy, I think, that's really important. And I think for men in particular, there's a very big struggle. Our messages as men is, you're not man enough if you don't have the corner office, if you don't have the right zip code, if you identify as heterosexual, women aren't going to want you if you don't make enough money. And even though that's shifting, right? That's what I'm talking about. There's this massive shift that's happening. We've got more stay-at-home fathers. We've got more men whose partner makes more money than they do. We've got that, but there's still this very loud message that says, you're not a man if you don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have that. And it's a constantly moving line.
Wow. So have you read the Happiness Equation or some of those happiness books? I mean, are they legit, or are they just scratching the surface? I'm not looking for you to rip anybody apart, but I'm just curious, like, what do you see there?
Well, I think some of the most powerful books that have been written on happiness have come from the spiritual and the mystics, and they were written about 700 years ago. Meister Eckhart and some of those folks. I think some of the stuff that's out there, even that's bringing this scientific attitude toward happiness, they're actually concluding the same thing. It's kind of like Brene Brown. Brene Brown quantified vulnerability. She has said, she's not saying anything new.
Yeah.
She's not saying anything new, but she has quantified it, and she has these powerful statements that she uses. And the folks who are talking about happiness, they're paying attention. They're doing exactly what Brene Brown did. They're paying attention to people's lives, and they're listening to people, and they're saying, like, okay, there's this 70-year study looking at happiness, a Harvard study, and it's looking at people over 70 years and is looking at happiness and what actually created happiness versus what they thought. And I would say there's a thread of consistency across all of those messages. And it's basically what we're saying. It's easy to say, oh, well, you can't take it with you. And a true measure of a man is by the love he has in his life. All those platitudes. But when you are face to face with your insecurity and your shame and that voice that tells you you're nothing if you don't have this much money, or you're nothing if you don't have this reputation, then those platitudes go out the window because those voices are so powerful.
Wow, that's good stuff, man. So let's talk about the water. What do you mean by the water? Because I saw that, and I've seen you post that a couple times, and I have to tell you, it confuses and befuddles me. So take me through that, Dan. What does that mean?
Well, actually, there's a post right now on Facebook that just came out about the water, where it just basically says the water are these experiences of reality that are so obvious we miss them in many ways, right? So it goes to this story. Two of my teachers, so to speak, are Anthony DeMello, who's a spiritual teacher. He was a Catholic priest from India with a PhD in psychology.
Whoa.
Yes. So a very integrated person, East and West, and intellectual and spiritual. And so he talked about how a person looking for God is very often like a fish looking for the water. Right? It's all around us. We're struggling to find God or that access to this higher purpose and meaning, and yet we're immersed in it. And then the other one is this guy, David Foster Wallace, who wrote Infinite Jest. He was an amazing guy. He did a commencement speech at Kenyon College. And he started it with the same story that I tell now almost every training or talk I give. I open it with, there's two fish at the bottom of the ocean. One fish swims up to these other two and says, hey guys, how's the water? And swims off. And the two fish look at each other and they say, what the hell is water? And that's the water, right? We're in it. And when I talk about masculinity, when I talk about the man rules, the woman rules, these ideas, we've been so immersed in it for so long, we don't really even see it. We're not that conscious of it. Yeah, you could tell me kind of your ideas of being a man, but do you really have a sense of the layers of consciousness that drive how you show up in individual relationships, and do you pay attention to it? I mean, I've been doing this as a practice for 20 years, and this consciousness still eludes me in a lot of ways. And the power of these ideas, of these man rules in particular, the woman rules, the man rules, they're so deeply embedded. Despite my best intentions, the man rules make decisions for me that have me acting contrary to the man I want to be a lot.
So, wow. So how do we, let's kind of bring this home, Dan. How do we even get this water, right? How do you even understand it? What is one or two things that we can do to be more in touch with the water, or more in touch with the rules?
Well, yeah, so let's just take it, because the water is a lot of stuff. The water is race. The water is class. The water is so many ways that we experience reality, right? There's the intellectual, there's the spiritual. But let's just focus on gender, because I think it's probably the most powerful aspect of the water. One of the most important ways is to bring deliberate attention to it. And what that is to literally say, okay, so what this guy, Dan, he's talking about this water, that's very abstract. Now he's talking about being a man. I'm very comfortable with the man that I am. Okay, are you? See, because as long as you make that statement, it's done. There's no inquiry there, right? But then what I would say is, okay, well, let's have you write down all the ideas that you have in your head, all these man rules, just write them out. What are the rules that you know about for being a man? Not the ones you follow, but what are the rules that society tells you have to follow? Now, just go through that list. Highlight the ones that work for you and highlight in a different color the ones that work against you. Just take a look at that. Just take a look. How often do you not ask for help as a man? How often do you choose control over vulnerability? How often do you go to anger than a more authentic emotion of fear or sadness? How often do you sit around with other men and joke about women and the GLBT individuals or anything like that in the group of men, because that's how some men bond, and you don't say anything or you laugh uncomfortably? So how often do you for the sake of acceptance, how often do you do something different than you know in your heart to be? So what I talk about is conscious masculinity, paying attention on a daily basis, paying attention to how I interact. How do I interact with my daughter? Okay, now how much of that has to do with the father I want to be? And then these man rules. I'm married, I identify as heterosexual, my wife. How do I interact with my wife? You know, just last night I was having a conversation with her. My feelings were hurt. Did I say, wow, honey, my feelings are hurt, I just need to take a deep breath? No. My feelings were hurt. I went to anger, started trying to control, and then started stepping away from the conversation, disconnecting. So I don't know that there's another way other than deliberate consciousness.
Yeah, deliberate consciousness and continuous inquiry, right? Asking the questions.
Yeah.
I think, right? It's a great way to get it started and to keep the conversation alive about the man rules, about the water, and about happiness or contentment. So that's good stuff, Dan. So in closing, how do people find more of your stuff? Because I think men's issues are busting open. We're absolutely seeing that, right? There's more consciousness, more vulnerability than ever. Where do the people find more of your work, and how do they get connected with you?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the easiest ways would be through the website, dangriffin.com. It's GRIFFIN.com. They can contact me directly, dan@dangriffin.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. Author Dan Griffin, author D Griffin. So author Dan Griffin on Facebook, author D Griffin on Twitter. And, I try to be out there. I've got 3 books. I've got a book called A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps for Men in Recovery. I've got a book called A Man's Way Through Relationships, which is just helping men navigate relationships with greater consciousness and intentionality. And then I've got a new one coming out that's right now it's called Conscious Fathering. And it's about fathering from the inside out. And it's all about how are we more aware of how we interact. So, going back to your question, one of the questions when we work with men, we give men one question really to meditate on. Every time you do something, just simply ask, how does that behavior fit with the man I want to be? And it either supports it or it doesn't. And if it didn't support it, then what do you want to do about that? Is the man I want to be a guy who snaps at his wife? Is the man I want to be a guy who is jealous of other people's success? Is the man I want to be the guy who hides in insecurity because he doesn't think he's successful enough? No. Okay. Well, then who is the man I want to be? And then how do I move toward that? And some men are going to say, the man I want to be, yeah, I want to sleep with as many women as I can and I want to make a lot of money. Okay, then that's your path. And I'm not going to judge that. You've got your journey and that's for you. That's truly for you. I'll offer an alternative. I'll offer my experience. having gone down some of that road. But if that's the man you want to be, go for it.
Wow. Good stuff. So asking yourself the man you want to be and how your behavior supports that. It's a great reminder for us, Dan. It's a great challenge for us each and every day as men. Thank you, my friend, for being here and for sharing your story and your insights into the man rules and more. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Thanks for having me.
For sure.